Public financial management, or PFM, describes a whole range of activities, starting, of course, off with the mobilization of revenues, be it through taxation or through customs, towards the preparation of the budget, towards the execution of the budget, that is, how is spending allocated, towards the accounting for expenditure at the end and the monitoring of expenditure. PFM is not just about activities themselves, it's also about where these activities happen. Do they happen at the central level, or do they happen at a regional or a local level? So is budgetary authority decentralized down into regions or local authorities? It's also about who's actually involved in these activities. Is it just civil servants and politicians who debate on and who decide on how the budget is allocated? Or does it allow for participation of citizens? And then how can citizens actually participate in these particular processes? So PFM is actually not a technical area, though it very often looks like it, because we talk about things such as drafting the budget or auditing. It's actually a hugely political area because it is about how resources are allocated and to whom. Public expenditure is a really important part of most countries' economies, very often the largest part of a country's economy. So corruption within the public sector and within the budget, and therefore within public financial management, has huge implications for the wider economy and the wider welfare of its citizens. Corruption in public financial management is also important for the delivery of public services because it can affect the amount of public services that are provided. It has implications for who receives public services and the quality of public services. So from that perspective, it's absolutely central to economic development and welfare. Equally important, though, it's also about the relationship between the state and the society. It's about how resources are allocated. It's about how those who are in charge of allocating resources and in managing public resources are held to account. It's about whose services are prioritized over the others, who are the beneficiaries of those. So it has really important implications for the wider architecture of the state. It is central to understanding the relationship between state and society, between different groups within society, and for understanding the way the state functions and works for its citizens. So corruption, in particular in the concept PFM system, is often seen as a principal agent problem. Now, principal agent problem is a situation where a principal, that could be a senior official, a politician, or the public as a whole, cannot hold the agent who's supposed to act on his or her behalf accountable effectively for what they do because they have imperfect information. The agent knows much more than the principal and therefore can act in ways that harms the interests of the principal. To give you an example, an official who knows more than his superiors can embezzle money and can hide that particular embezzlement. But here's also an interesting example. How do you respond to these kind of problems? So in the Ugandan case, they had, of course, the expenditure tracking survey, but that in itself did not necessarily reduce corruption, even though it helped to expose it. But it was then combined with a public information campaign, a newspaper campaign, which generated substantial political pressure. And it was through this pressure that actually leakage was reduced, and 84% of the funds now actually reached the school. So a substantial reduction in corruption in that particular area. So one example of an intervention to address collective action problems are the integrity pacts that Transparency International in particular has promoted in procurement processes for over a decade now. And these integrity pacts bring together governments who are procuring for a particular contract, as well as all the bidders, in a formal agreement not to bribe, not to collude, and not to accept bribes. And as part of this agreement, they establish an independent monitor who monitors the whole process to ensure compliance with the integrity pact. So this helps to overcome, or can help to overcome, this collective action problem. However, it also relies on a whole range of contextual factors to be successful. Does the monitor have access to sufficient information? How easy is it to monitor compliance with the Integrity Pact? What are the consequences of actually breaking the pact? Are there any sanctions? How is it enforced? What happens in the future, for example, with future procurement contracts? Does it bar them from it? So what are the future costs of actually violating that pact? and thereby risking detection and risking sanctions. So there are a whole range of contextual factors that any reform needs to address as well, which go beyond the kind of narrow institutions, narrow intervention that would address the specific corruption problem. Just as in almost all other areas of anti-corruption, there's probably no silver bullet, not a single intervention that would have a transformative effect. I quite like to use the analogy to British cycling and David Brailsford, who said that you have lots of small changes that interact with each other, that change things and improve things at the margin, but all together, and bringing them all together, adds up to what is a transformative effect, and in the context of corruption would lead to a substantial reduction in corruption. It's about greater transparency. It's about more public information and awareness. It's about the ability to mobilize the public around a particular issue and against corruption. It is around sanctions that can be imposed and the expectation of sanctions that they will actually be imposed and that they will have a consequence and people will be punished. It's bringing all of those together that has had an effect in these interventions rather than just one particular small intervention. And of course, it's the context within which they operate, the particular political context. I think there are three key challenges to effective anti-corruption reforms in public financial management. And the first one, unsurprisingly, is the political willingness of elites of governments to actually engage in anti-corruption reforms in this area. As we said earlier, the budget is a key part of most countries' economy. It's also a key source of patronage, a key source of building and sustaining political coalitions and coalitions of power. So the willingness of governments to dramatically increase transparency within the budget, to reduce their discretion, to reduce their ability to use the budget to sustain a political coalition is very often limited, and unsurprisingly so. So these reforms also need to address the question of how can you generate the political will to actually address these kind of reforms. The second challenge to effective anti-corruption reforms in PFM is the wider environment. We know that transparency reforms, for example, tend to be much more effective if they happen in a context where you can also exert public pressure, where you can mobilize. So where you, for example, have press freedom, where you can run a public information campaign that helps mobilize the population against corruption. In environments where you don't have such a context, where, for example, you don't have press freedom, where you don't have freedom of assembly, it is much more difficult for citizens to access this kind of information, even the information generated by tools such as expenditure tracking surveys. It's much more difficult to act upon it, to actually mobilize around it. And so you're much less likely to see actual change around corruption. I think a third key challenge is actual government capacity. To be able to monitor civil servants and officials more effectively and thereby reduce corruption, to reduce discretion, to increase transparency, requires governance capacity. It requires the capacity to collect data, to manage and interpret data, to actually report. And of course, there are a range of states, especially states that have experienced conflict, that are inherently fragile, that don't necessarily have these kinds of governance capacities. And therefore, implementing these kind of reforms is much more difficult. So I think in summary, what has shown that while PFM reforms, and in particular reforms to address corruption in PFM, very often seem highly technical because they deal with issues that seem quite arcane, like budget preparation processes, budget execution processes. They are actually deeply political in both their consequences, but also with regard to the factors that shape their effectiveness. Any process or any intervention that affects the management of public finances has profound political implications. That also means that it is likely to lead to profound political responses. And without understanding the wider political environment within which these systems are embedded, it is difficult to develop interventions that can effectively reform them.